Thank you guys so much for joining. We have Chris Haney here today to talk about actually a book that he has and some more info about the Ivory-billed woodpecker. So, Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Derek and Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say a little bit about Wisconsin. It's it's one of my favorite states because I have a lot of dear friends from there. My very first boss in graduate school was from Rice Lake, uh, and I have a good colleague just across town who's a natural resource economist, Brian Check. I'm going to do an interview with him in a few weeks. He's from Wisconsin. And one of my coworkers with whom I do seabird surveys, Dan Bauer, is also from Wisconsin. So I have, it's a place very near and dear to my heart. So it's a real pleasure to be with you tonight. And I'll start tonight by opening my slide presentation and telling you a little bit about how I got started with Ivorybill. I've been a birder since I was 6 years old. I had as my first teacher in grade 1 a bird bander. She and her husband taught 2 classrooms, grades 1 through 8. It was a really small school in rural Tennessee. And that sort of reinforced my interest in natural history. I already had it there, but this was sort of what concretized that interest. I was always interested in extinct animals and birds. They were the kinds of thing that I suspect many young boys of my era, raised in the 1960s, when there were lots of TV shows, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, we sort of romanticized the frontier. And one of the things I noticed in myself was almost a kind of nostalgic longing for hoping or wishing I could have lived back in a time when some of these extinct birds and animals were around. I can't say that I had a particular or specific interest in the Ivory-billed woodpecker. In fact, it might be more honest for me to say that it wasn't at the top of my list. Probably Carolina parakeet and passenger pigeon were at the apex, and maybe a few other birds were too. There's a reason that I might have a chance to elaborate on that, but I'm going to tell you how I finally and eventually did get extremely interested in the Ivory-billed woodpecker. Throughout my childhood and into my teen years, my maternal grandfather used to give me at birthdays and Christmas these old, sometimes 19th century bird books, but very often early 20th century. So the publication dates might be late, 1800s through around the 1930s. And I would race to the sections on extinct birds and read up about all of these things that I couldn't see anymore as a young birder. Things like Labrador duck, great auk, heath hen. And for most of my life, I put Ivory-billed woodpecker in that same category. It was just over there, didn't give it too much thought. I assumed it was extinct, didn't have rigid beliefs either way, but that was what I read and saw. That changed in about 2004 and 5, and then the years thereafter, as I watched us, that means humans, react to the rediscovery of Ivory-billed woodpecker in the big woods of Arkansas, and later found as well in northwestern Florida. And there were a couple of things that really puzzled me, that intrigued me and pulled me in and fixed me, I guess, on why Ivory-bill was interesting. And one of them is I'm trained as an environmental scientist. And so one of the things I typically do is look for patterns and try to make sense or synthesize information as I see it and hear it. And one of the first things I noticed when I started reading about newspaper accounts, magazine accounts, what my colleagues were saying about Ivory-bill in the aughts, that is to say, the mid 2000s, it wasn't lining up with what I had read about the bird when I was a young boy. So I was trying to take what I was hearing from them, comparing it to my memory, and sometimes I'd have to go back to the books and kind of compare and contrast to make sure that my memory was correct. And I did notice these discrepancies, these contradictions. And as a scientist, these little puzzles kind of intrigue us, and we're tempted to sort of follow them until we figure out what's going on. So that was one big pull. The strangest thing, though, was me watching my fellow humans react to the putative ivory-bill in the big woods of Arkansas. And I just couldn't make sense of it. I would see everything from obsessive, almost Don Quixote-like questing for the bird to adamant, bitter anger and rather nasty comments about its continued existence. And again, as a lifelong student of birds, as a birder, I couldn't make sense of this, and it just hooked me and pulled me in. Those two things, the sort of biological contradictions over here and then the bizarre behavior of us, that's what led me into researching this book, which I started in some fashion in the late aughts by just pulling information together. But the writing process unfolded over the next decade and finished just earlier this year. So from start to finish, it was about a 15-year endeavor. And I did discover along the way some interesting tidbits about the woodpecker, and we'll talk about some of those tonight. But the biggest surprise to me was how easily this bird tricks us, how easily the vast uncertainty, the enigmatic nature of the ivory-bill that's always been there, how much that messes with our heads, and how frankly irrational and illogical we can be in trying to fill in the gaps, connect the dots. That journey for me, which was partially an external journey into the life of the bird itself, but then an interior journey into how the wiring in our heads work, led to this book. And it's called Woody's Last Laugh: How the Extinct Ivory-billed Woodpecker Fools Us into Making 53 Thinking Errors. And I'm going to date myself here, but to me, the ivory-billed woodpecker was very much like the cartoon Woody the Woodpecker. And we're like Wally the Walrus, who gets set up by this cartoon woodpecker and constantly gets pranked. And pranking is a good sensation because it describes quite often how I felt as I made these really what I thought were stunning discoveries about the bird. And we'll talk about some of those. It's impossible to talk about the ivory-billed woodpecker without referring to the only real field study that we ever had for it. The study was conducted in the late 1930s in northeastern Louisiana. It was by a young student, graduate student at Cornell University named James T. Tanner. And it was focused, if you can see the map, there's some black text on the left that says Singer Tract, now known as the Tensaw River National Wildlife Refuge. That little red spot there is the region in which Jim Tanner studied ivory-bill. And we are incredibly fortunate to have this study because everything else that we know about the bird is piecemeal and mostly anecdotal, written down in narrative form, but without much in the way of numbers. So this is really, really valuable. Let's take a minute and just look at the map first. And you can see there that at one time, the range of the ivory-billed woodpecker was rather large. It stretched from the Carolinas down across Florida, all the way up the interior Mississippi River Valley, and some of the tributaries west into Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Well, this range may not be as large as some of our North American birds. It's still quite large for a very rare bird. And that presents some problems in how much we can be certain of ourselves today. But look how tiny that little area is that Jim Tanner studied these birds. I'm going to tell you something interesting about this part of Louisiana. Prior to Tanner's study, it had been largely vacant of human occupation for hundreds of years. In the late 1600s, the Native Americans that lived there, the Tensaw Indians, they were agricultural, they were scattered in a half dozen villages, and they got in lots of trouble with their Native American neighbors. Because there was so much strife, the French, who controlled that region at the time, decided to move them. So in the early 1700s, they moved the Tensaw Indians all the way to Alabama. There's a Tensaw River there, spelled differently, but that's where they were moved. It stayed vacant from then until the decades just before the Civil War, the 1830s. When agricultural land to the east got overtilled, settlers moved into this part of Louisiana and started raising cotton in a plantation economy. The Civil War started. This was close enough to Vicksburg that it got terrible fighting. The small towns there were burned to the ground. People left, and it was depopulated largely until Tanner showed up again in the 1930s. When he showed up, that land had been protected. It was a strict nature reserve with full-time wardens who were there to guard against any poaching. So if we think about this history, what we can say is the ivory-billed woodpecker in this particular locale had almost a uniquely protective history. There was never a lot of people there. When they were there, they were either engaged in something else, and the area had several decades of strict protection before this study was started. So what we can surmise from that is that these woodpeckers were not instinctually wary of humans. We know that they were elsewhere because we can go back to the 1830s and read accounts from naturalists that say it was one of the most cunning birds that wore feathers. However, unfortunately, because these birds were photographed, images were taken of movies and so forth, one young ivory-bill was even photographed on the head of the guide and the warden of the Singer Tract, which you can see here, got his name Sonny Boy. And this led us to believe that the ivory-bill was not a particularly wary bird. It's fairly incautious. But how this is not what other naturalists said for other areas. What's my point here? What we think we know about this woodpecker is almost all gleaned from this study. But that's a reckless thing to do if you're a scientist. If you only have a sample size of one, you can't really generalize it and say that it's characteristic of a species everywhere. This would be true for any bird. We could study, I don't know, hooded warblers in rhododendron thickets, but that wouldn't tell us anything about their habitats other places. And much the same thing happened with ivory-bill. We anchored on this and think we know a lot more about it than we do because we only have this one in-depth study. This bird has long perplexed us. This is not new. Now, it is kind of funny to watch each successive generation of Americans kind of come to terms with the ivory-bill and realize how little we know. But it goes, this mystery and enigma goes way back. I'm going to just read a couple of quotes from early naturalists, starting in 1900 by Bayer. He says, accounts of the habits of the species seem to be considerably at variance, meaning he's looking at what this person says and that person says, and he can't quite reconcile. Not very long afterward, Hoyt, who's speaking, I think, from the state of Florida, says, I can state some facts that do not agree with other writers, meaning that he too was seeing or hearing things about the bird that he couldn't square. Allen and Kellogg were two scientists from Cornell who were actually the mentors of Jim Tanner. They were his professors. And so they were basically supervising his work in the Singer tract on Ivory-bill. Here's what they said in a publication that they produced. Some of our observations are at variance with those published by others, meaning they were seeing things too that didn't add up or didn't match what other people had seen or heard. The last one, though, is the most intriguing. Richard Poe was the official scientist. In those days, he might have been called, or in today's terms, he would be called the chief scientist of the National Audubon Society. The National Audubon Society had been the research and fiscal sponsor for Tanner's study in Louisiana. They had given the grant funds for this to be undertaken. When Richard Poe went down to the Singer tract in the mid-1940s, so this was 6 or 7 years after Tanner's study was complete, he looked around, he had read the monograph, so he was clearly aware of the study. And he went back to the same site. Here's what he said. The Ivory-bill problem puzzles me exceedingly. And I do not feel that Tanner's report begins to explain the reasons for the drastic decline in this species. So see here, we actually have a contemporary, someone who was on the ground, someone who saw the birds, someone who had a role in this study. And after all of that information was in and it was written up, the scientist is going, this thing, it still doesn't add up. I don't believe this study begins to explain the reasons why this bird is so rare. And that's something that I want us to keep in mind. There is so much uncertainty tethered to this bird, and always has been, that we exaggerate how much we know. Now, the bad thing is we can't be certain. The good thing is it might expand our awareness and we might be more receptive to alternative stories and narratives about the woodpecker, not all of which are doom and gloom. Before we go any further, I just want to introduce a few terms that I might bandy about here and there, and I don't want to leave them unattended. Extinction is a term that was misused when back in the 1950s. It was actually applied in ways that it shouldn't have been. I won't go there. Today, we define extinction as the death of every last individual in a species, everyone, everywhere. And we evidence extinction by quantitative surveys that demonstrate with high probability that animal or plant's absence throughout its entire range. So see, there's two things here. There's two pieces. Every last one is dead, every last individual. And we've evidenced that through some kind of survey that responsibly shows and credibly shows that the animal or plant is really gone, not just gone because we haven't bothered to look. There's a couple of other terms. One is Lazarus species. Lazarus, and Lazarus plant or animal, is some species or population that was once believed to be extinct, but then is later refound. It's rediscovered as extant. And I'm going to give us probably about a dozen examples of birds from around the world that fit that definition, a Lazarus species. And then lastly is the term cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is a kind of mind trick that affects every single one of us all the time. Nobody is immune. But these biases are systematic, they're very predictable, but they're usually unconscious and they stray or deviate from accuracy, rationality, or logic. Okay, so cognitive bias is simply a mind shortcut. It doesn't have anything to do about us stereotyping groups of people. It doesn't have anything to do with inherent bias, which is a kind of association that we make in our heads stereotypically when we link, I don't know, I guess you would link camouflage green and brown with a hunter, that sort of association. Rather, cognitive bias affects everybody. It's not something that you can take a training session and then be devoid of. So it's a particular kind of bias and it only refers to mental shortcuts. All right, well, let's look at some of these bird species that we thought we were just so sure they were extinct, but it later turns out they were very much alive. So we're going to start with a very colorful little forest bird called the Guernsey's pitta. The Guernsey's pitta is found in Myanmar, formerly Burma, and in Thailand. It was briefly found, but then immediately disappeared in the early 1950s, but rediscovered in 1986. So it was only missing 34 years. This is actually one of the shortest ones I'm going to show you. So we'll see some that are considerably longer than that. This next bird is a brush finch called the Antioquia brush finch, found in the Colombian Andes of northern South America. It went missing in 1971, but it was refound in 2018. So it was missing just a little bit less than half a century for 47 years. This next drab-looking bird is something called the Jordan's babbler. It's another species found in Myanmar. It was found and went missing in 1941, rediscovered in 2014, missing for 73 years. So we're getting a little longer, and that'll be the pattern here. Next one is a very colorful small ground dove called the blue-eyed ground dove, found in the Cerrado region of Brazil. It went missing in 1941, like the Jordan's babbler, rediscovered in 2015, missing for 74 years. This bird is famous for another reason. This is called the Cebu flower picker. The Cebu flower picker is found only on that island, Cebu Island, in the Philippines. First went missing in 1909. And this bird was really, I mean, everyone was certain it was gone because there was hardly any forest left on Cebu. It had all been cleared for agriculture. There were just ragged little fragments of trees here and there. We were just certain it was gone. In fact, it was rediscovered in 1992 after an absence of 83 years. And not only was it rediscovered, it was rediscovered in 3 or 4 places. So again, our minds are not infallible when it comes to guesswork about extinction. We're not really that good at telling whether an animal is extinct or not. This bird was also famous for another reason. The Cebu flower pecker got credit for showcasing, shining a spotlight on this mistake that we make about declaring species extinct too soon. That mistake is called the Romeo Error, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. This next one is a colorful little bird. It's called the Damar flycatcher. The Damar flycatcher is found on only that island, Damar Island, Indonesia, not a very big island. It was found and described by Victorian era collection ornithologists who were working for natural history museums. They found a few, collected them, took them back to Europe. and then it disappeared. But it was refound in 2001 after an absence of 103 years. And when it was discovered, it wasn't even that rare. This is a bird that just kind of went off our radar and we forgot about it. Nobody really bothered to look when scientists went back and engaged in really dedicated, systematic surveys. They found it again. Again, this bird was gone a century. This next one is intriguing for another reason, because it shares something in common with the ivory-billed woodpecker. This bird is called the banggai crow. The banggai crow is also found in Indonesia and central Sulawesi. The banggai crow went missing in 1900. It was rediscovered, refound in 2007 after an absence of 107 years. Now, one of the reasons this bird sort of hid in plain sight is that it bears a striking resemblance to another corvid, the slender-billed crow. Sound familiar? In this case, it's not that the bird was truly missing, obviously, but it might have been overlooked because it resembled another crow. Well, let's see, get my pointer going the right direction. This next one is the, this little guy is called the Indian forest owlet. It went missing in 1884, refound in 1997, missing 113 years. Again, we're not good at guessing about bird extinctions. This next is a very large reed warbler called the large-billed reed warbler. It was found or described to science in 1867, went missing like some of these other birds, refound after 139 years. These next two are my favorites, and it's not just because I study seabirds. They illustrate this error, these mistakes that we make in our head about bird extinctions extremely well. And they caution us to be a bit more humble, or I think they should caution us to be more humble. This bird is called the New Zealand storm petrel. The New Zealand storm petrel was described by, I think, three specimens collected in 1850. So this bird was described to science before Darwin's Origin of the Species was published. So it was a long time ago. When the bird was rediscovered in 2003, it had been missing for 153 years. Well, now that's remarkable in itself, but it gets better. When the breeding grounds of this novel and quite distinctive looking storm petrel were found, they were 40 kilometers away from Auckland, New Zealand, that country's largest city. So here is a species that was hiding in the large, or not far from the largest metropolitan area in that country. Again, this should caution us about thinking that we know everything, that we can see or detect everything. When it comes to nature, when it comes to animals that are rare or local, our minds are fallible. But the prize among all birds for its remarkable hiding ability is this one, the Bermuda petrel. Now, the Bermuda petrel in size has a wingspan that's very, very similar to that of the ivory-billed woodpecker. Its body is shorter and its weight is substantially less, but it's not altogether too different in size from an ivory-billed woodpecker. The Bermuda petrel was thought to have gone extinct in 1620, but it was found in the low tens in number, breeding on the islets off Bermuda more than 3 centuries later. So this bird hid from us for 300 years, and it did so on a very small island archipelago right off the southeastern United States. And if you've ever been to Bermuda, you know it's really, really full of people. There's people everywhere. So again, this illustrates we simply cannot trust our own senses to be everywhere all the time and know what happens. So what is the Romeo error? It's simply this. It's guessing that a species is gone, that it's dead, when it isn't. It's still very much alive. Well, why do we call it the Romeo error? Its name for the Shakespeare play, Romeo and Juliet. If you remember the plot line, basically, Romeo Montague shows up at the Capulet crypt where his beloved Juliet has taken a potion that sort of puts her into a sleep. He thinks, though, that she's dead. He's made a mistake about death. And that mistake leads to great tragedy because thinking she's gone, he takes his own life. When she wakes up, she sees him dead, and then Juliet also commits suicide. So again, Romeo error is the term from the Cebu flower pecker. That was when it was first shown in the literature, this term, when we get extinctions wrong. Well, this is actually surprisingly common. In the last 130 years, we've refound or rediscovered between 350 and 400 species of vertebrate animals. That's how many have been rediscovered. And not only have we done this, the rate of refinding them is increasing, meaning that we're finding more and more as the years go by. These Lazarus species went missing on average for about 61 years. That's all vertebrates. For birds, the gap was a little longer. That's the little graph there in the middle, 64 years. And that's a plot of the number of rediscoveries versus the number of years they went missing. And you can see that most of them are clustered under 100 years, but that's still a long time to be out of our awareness. And some of them, like the Bermuda petrel, all the way up to 330 years. Of these Lazarus animals, 86% of them still remain highly threatened. They're still imperiled. They're still very rare. The reason we have to be careful about Romeo error, the reason it's so serious is this. If we give up on a species too soon, if we assume death when they're still alive, we may be placing that plant or animal in greater jeopardy because we may withdraw the protections too soon, leaving any lingering survivors even all the more vulnerable to threats. Does this sound like maybe a recent proposal to delist the Ivory-billed woodpecker and 22 other species as extinct? Yes, and that's the reason I'm emphasizing this. We have to be very careful about how much we really know about extinction. Just for your edification, I will say that the Romeo error comes from a faulty circuit in our head called base rate fallacy. That's when we misjudge some background rate. So all of these rediscovered animals teach us that we need to be humble and not think that we can always guess about extinction. So in particular, individual cases, we're especially prone to be inaccurate. And base rate fallacy, ignoring this background rate of refound animals, but then saying that bird or that plant or that turtle or that fish, we know they're extinct. That's where it becomes dangerous because there is this base rate that tells us we are in fact wrong about extinction. Well, where does base rate fallacy come from? It's a class of cognitive error, a class of mental mistakes called the neglect of probability. As individual humans, we are not good at judging probability. We're notoriously bad at it. We started committing Romeo error with the Ivory-billed woodpecker about 1913. That was the first time in which authors, naturalists of that age started to say that the bird was going extinct or that it was in some places already extinct. Now, a couple of things reinforce this extinction paradigm for Ivory-bill. One was that it got tethered to two very real extinctions, that of the Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon. The last survivors were in the Cincinnati Zoo in the 19 teens, and watching those last survivors die was a nationally viewed spectacle, and it was widely carried in newspapers at the time. So we were concerned about extinction because we saw these other animals that were part of our natural heritage disappear as the frontier closed in America. We became more modern and cosmopolitan and relatively more centered in cities. That was one thing that sort of pulled the ivory-bill into the extinction paradigm. Another was the very real fact that during the late 1800s and early 1900s, lots of ivory-bills were collected for museums, for purposes of putting in people's living rooms and sitting rooms. So there was a very real threat. But what it did is these circumstances set up our heads for a mistake. Because from then on, whenever the bird was refound, it would then go extinct again, then get refound, then go extinct again. You see the pattern. And this created a phoenix-like myth in our heads. This magical, startling bird that managed to sort of resurrect every generation or so in the American experience. That's one of the reasons I think we're so obsessed with the bird today. It happens to fit a lot of our allegory and our myth as a species. All right. I'm going to illustrate some of the other, we're going to dive down into the particular tricks that the ivory-bill plays on us. And this is one that I've become fond of in the last few weeks. So I'm going to ask you, the viewer, to pick which of these images most accurate, what's the best image of a living ivory-billed woodpecker in these 4 frames?
All right, Ryan, I'm going to have you pick because I know about these images. So this one's on you.
I feel like I've got to get a better look at this.
I'm going to say there is no trick here. These are all 4 images purporting to be ivory-billed woodpeckers, and as far as I know, they are. So it's not like I'm throwing something else in here to trick you. It's just a look at which one of these would give you the strongest evidence for a living ivory-billed woodpecker.
Yeah, so the thing about it is the one on the left, if it were clear, like something about it just looks off because it looks like almost a watercolor painting. Then the one, yeah, okay. So if it's evidence of a living bird,
Chris
then
is like, I painted it myself this morning.
Yeah, exactly. Like I can't really pick that one. I'm hard pressed to say any of them are actual evidence of an ivory-billed woodpecker, just because to my eyes, making comparisons of distance doesn't necessarily, that can be, fooling people. The one on the bottom left is so vague, it's hard to tell. The one on the bottom right looks like a field sketch. So, I mean, if the one on the left is accurate, the top left is accurate, that one would give me the most cause to believe. If somebody just said, I saw this exact thing and I painted it and I've never seen any sort of birds or woodpeckers before, so they didn't have a knowledge of what they were looking for, I would trust that one, if that makes sense.
Well, so there's no wrong answer to this. They are all purported images of the ivory-billed woodpecker, but I'll go through the history of each one of them to just sort of fill in. The first one, the one on the upper left, is a sketch from 1944. This was the drawing by the bird artist Don Eckelberry. This is the evidence. Now, again, this is a sketch of a bird that someone said they saw in Louisiana. So it's not a filled-in photograph. It's simply a sketch of what they claim they saw. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is actually a photograph taken by Jim Tanner at the Singer Tract in the late 1930s. There are ivory-bills allegedly in this scene. If you can't find them, I don't know if you can see my pointer. Can you see my pointer here on the screen?
I feel like I just
Yeah,
need
we
to get
can.
really, really close to it to try to
Yeah,
decipher what
It
it
looks
is.
like a
it's on.
Rorschach test. That's what it looks
It
like to me.
is.
If
It
you've seen
is.
Ivory
And
Bills, what does that tell you about you then?
You're obsessed with ivory
exactly.
bills.
So you'd be forgiven if you went. No, thank you. This the one over here on the lower right is a picture taken by Jim Tanner's mentors, Allen and Kellogg. That little circle is of a purported male ivory-billed woodpecker in some pine trees in North Florida. Now, again, you don't gain anything by blowing these up. I'm not trying to portray these as murky or anything. That's just the way they were.
They just are
And then
murky.
these were amateur shots and from get-go. Now the last one, the upper right, this one's an intriguing. This is a video capture, the Lenovo video of the bird seen in the big woods of Arkansas, 2004 or 5.
Chris,
Now this one is.
I'll tell you, based on some of the comments I've gotten from other ivory-billed stuff, people are very passionate about whether they think the Lenovo video is legitimate or not. Like, people are willing to have huge discussions about
Put their life on the line
that
for it.
video clip, And I think
Yeah.
there's still so much like discussion on that.
Yeah, no question. The interesting thing about this image, though, is the following. Of any of these, it's the only one that gives us actual data because it gives us scaled measurements to a tree trunk. And so we can use that information to sort of reverse engineer the size of this bird. As they went back and they measured the tree trunks at each of those 2 locations and were able to actually measure that. So again, these were purposely put up here, and I want to make 2 points from them. Number one, and I just confirmed this yesterday with Chuck Hunter of Fish and Wildlife Service in Atlanta. Aside from the photographs and the videos taken by Tanner in the Singer Tract in Louisiana in the 1930s, aside from those, there are no images before or after that ever came close to that quality. They're all like this, all of them. So what that tells us is that the Singer Tract study was not only singular in terms of what it told us about the woodpecker's habits, its life history, its behavior, so forth. It's also unique in that it is the only one that provides the kind of tangible evidence that certain social identities today claim that they need to verify a still living ivory-bill. Now, the need to verify a bird as still living is problematic. That is a whole head trip on its own. But my point here is to just illustrate that the evidence that we gather for this bird and have gathered has always been murky and contentious, except for the Singer Tract study. That's it.
And I also wanted to point out with the Singer Tract, that was a known nest cavity. It's like the birds had to come back and they could stake that out. Not that I know of anyone besides Tanner has found a cavity that they could stake out like that.
In Cuba, they did and could.
Oh, okay.
There's some intriguing photos, and I wish I knew some more of the provenance of these. They were in the Vireo collection at the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences, and they show a bird in a cavity with its head poking out at different angles, so it doesn't look like the bird is fixed in there or anything. It looks plausible. The bill's light and so forth. Chuck, and other people know more about the provenance of those photos. I think they were taken in the 1960s. Then, of course, there's the Fielding Lewis photographs that were taken in Louisiana in the 1970s. But my point is, we are arbitrary and capricious in the extreme in what we put forth as the kind of evidence that we think we need for a still living Ivory-billed woodpecker. This 1944 sketch, that's the evidence given for the last Ivory-bill. So when you pick up a newspaper account and you read that says, last credibly seen in World War II, this is what they're talking about, a sketch.
I want to point out, this is one of Ryan's biggest pet peeves, is when someone sees a rare bird and they're like, I submitted a sketch of what I saw, because it always bothers him.
Well, there's two differences that I believe about the sketches. Is if there's somebody that has a point to prove. So you'll see sketches for rare birds like, oh, I saw this bird and here's what it looked like. It's clearly this based on my sketch. I think that's different than, I don't know anything about birds. I have nothing to prove. This is exactly what I saw. So there's kind of, who's the one sketching and for what purpose is the sketch happening? But yes, Derek is right. That is a pet peeve of mine.
So the arbitrary nature of this is that this image, this evidence was used to mark the demise of the bird. That was the benchmark for extinction. That was where the flag got planted, on that hill. And so when you read modern accounts and when you pick up a newspaper or a magazine, almost invariably they will say last credibly reported in 1940, World War II era. This is why. But notice, if we flipped, would this kind of evidence ever be allowed to be used as evidence of a still living Ivory-bill? Of course not. Why in the world was it ever suitable to mark the final death of an entire species? That's not rational. In fact, that's so bizarre as to, almost close shop and go home. And in fact, this is where our minds really take off and mess with us. We don't need to prove life. How did we get there? We constantly are chasing proof of life for near extinct animals. The assumption is they're still alive. If I don't see my Uncle Bob for 5 years, I do not assume that he's dead. I can see him lying on a couch and not moving for 3 hours. I still don't assume that he's dead. We only go to death when the evidence is there, but we do not do this in conservation biology. And that's a problem. And that problem comes from up here, not out there. But the other peculiar thing about evidence in Ivory-bill is that in human endeavors, we use a scale, a sliding scale of evidentiary proof. Courtrooms are a good example. In civil matters, a preponderance of evidence is 50.0001%. It only has to be slightly more than 50-50. That's enough. Now, in criminal matters, particularly felonies, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt, up around 95-99%.
I was going to say, would you then say your slogan for it would be extant until proven extinct?
That is the standard that the IUCN uses. That is the standard that BirdLife uses. That is the standard that much of conservation biology has learned through its mistakes that we have to use. If you need something that's in a gray area, presumed extinct or near extinct, but it's extant until proven extinct, that is correct. That is the safe way to avoid Romeo error. That's the safe way to avoid pulling protections too soon. Now, it may not mean that you have to spend a lot of money on this, but you can do other things that don't cost money for species that are right at the edge of extinction. But we already know what we get extinction wrong. There's just too many examples of it now. And to fail to use our learning about Romeo error and to try to attach the label of extinction too soon what that does is it not only does it jeopardize the plant or animal in question, it jeopardizes the credibility of the entity or the organization or the social identity making that claim. If we say something's extinct and then it's later refound, the public can go, yeah, you guys are always exaggerating. You're exaggerating climate change. You're exaggerating pollution in our waterways. Now you're exaggerating extinction. And so there is a cost. There is a real cost, actually plural, costs with an S, in trying to claim something is extinct too soon. Let me go to a couple of other odd things about Ivory-billed. So we're going to scrutinize that last accepted or confirmed report of Ivory-bill from the World War II era. Again, it's based on nothing other than a sketch by the artist Don Eccleberry. There's no physical evidence that accompanies it, none. It relies on a specious error called an appeal to authority, meaning that that person over there, because I recognize their name or their name has more recognition or they have a degree or whatever, that authority I'll believe. But if John Q. Public, who's out fishing, sees an Ivory-bill, nope, not going to believe it. And that's not a good evaluation of evidence. We cannot rely on appeals to authority. And I never understood this even as a boy. I couldn't, it wasn't just because Roger Torrey Peterson went down there and saw the bird, but what about Herbert Stoddard, who was a wildlife biologist in Georgia who saw it? He wasn't given that same level. Again, that is a cognitive error. It's our heads playing tricks on us. But because this story has been constantly repeated now for 70 plus years, it's now become an availability cascade, meaning that it's easy to access. If you're a reporter working for a magazine or a newspaper, it's easy to go get this story. And because it's so available, it gets repeated over and over even more. And because it's repeated, we feel compelled to jump on the bandwagon with everyone else. So starting with the appeal to authority, we have an availability cascade, and then the bandwagon fallacy where, hey, everybody says so, I'm going to go along because I don't want to sort of buck the crowd. And this incident is no more evidence for the bird's extinction than it is for the dodo. It's just a story, that's all. There's also some other logical problems with the way we treat Ivory-bill. We are demanded to consider that we confuse pileated with the Ivory-bill. In fact, most modern day sightings, or almost any sighting since the 1940s, are usually denigrated as cases of mistaken identity. So that's green lighted. Confuse pileated for Ivory-bill? Yes. Well, what about confusing Ivory-bill for pileated? Where are the warnings about that? You can't find them. So this is not a logical position to hold. If they're so much alike, why does the resemblance only run in one direction? If they're so much alike and we confuse pileated for Ivory-bill, we should also be able to confuse Ivory-bill for pileated.
I think that's a really good point. And I don't remember where I read this story, but I remember somebody saying they were talking to hunters one time, and because the pileated, some people describe them as, oh, it looks like it's wearing a black backpack, and the Ivory-bill looks like it's wearing a white backpack. And they were like, oh, we thought the white-backed ones were males and the white-backed ones were females. So it's like, there's a lot of, there can be a lot of misinterpretation for that kind of stuff. So I think that's a really good point about if they're that similar, why can't it go the other way?
Yeah, and the fact that we haven't even talked about this, and even brought it up and allowed it to sort of be evaluated and analyzed in our dialogues, is puzzling to me. But if they're so much alike, we can't just have the resemblance go one direction. If we do, that's a signal that we're trying to come up with special pleading. We're trying to make everything fit because we're uncomfortable. And that is a sign that we need to back off and take a wider view. A couple of other things about similarities between pileated and ivory-bill. And this was one of the things that has long troubled me, now for about 2 decades. When the birds, putative ivory-bills were seen in Arkansas and Florida, again, the Lenovo video is a good example of people rushing into a bogus certitude that it was a pileated woodpecker. And I probably have wasted more hours looking at that video than anyone, or almost anyone. And I still can't make a clean determination one way or the other. I lean in one direction above the other, but I don't discard either one, and I don't discard a third option, which is I don't know. But anyway, if we go back to the similarity, here's another peculiar thing. Where are all the cases of mistaken identity with Bachman's warbler and Eskimo curlew? We don't have them. And if you look at these images, I think a Bachman's warbler looks frightfully like a hooded warbler to anybody but maybe a really keen birder who has lots of experience with the hooded. And the curlews are even more problematic. They're far more problematic to me as a field ornithologist than the 2 woodpeckers. And this puzzles me because if we're making up in our heads ivory-billed woodpeckers because we want to see them, they're rare, we're suggestible, we have filled with hope, all of these things, where is all of that with these other 2 birds? It ain't there. We don't have 100 incidents of Bachman's warbler or Eskimo curlew since the 1940s, like we do with ivory-billed woodpecker. 100 incidents, and each incident can consist of multiple lines of evidence by as many as 8 or 9 observers. We don't have anything like that for these other 2 birds. And so this troubles me because ivory-billed woodpecker is not acting and behaving like a properly extinct bird ought to. Now you can make the case that, oh, ivory-bill is so spectacular, it's so wonderful, it's so iconic, it's so incredible. The problem is, to me, as a birder, it's a big black and white red woodpecker. I honestly, ivory-billed woodpecker's never been all that to me in terms of its physical appearance and size. It's just another big black and white red woodpecker. Now I've seen Campephalus in the tropics, so maybe that sort of stunts my appreciation, but it's not like Carolina parakeet. You know, it's not like something unique in the bird world. It's not that different. And so I have real problems with this special pleading surrounding all of the observations of ivory-billed woodpecker. It doesn't make sense to me. If we're that irrational and we want to see things because they're rare and special, why aren't we seeing more Bachman's warblers for the same faulty reasons? Why aren't we seeing more Eskimo curlews for the same faulty reasons? But we're not. And that, I think, is a tell. And in the wiring of her head, this is a chance for us to step away from an error called Bayesian conservatism, when we don't update our beliefs about something like extinction, when we have new information like this. It's like, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't be quite so confident about extinction if people are still reporting it. And they're not reporting other extinct or near extinct birds. Maybe I shouldn't be quite so absolutely 100% certain. That's the logical tack to take, but many of us find that extremely hard to do. So the theory about why we have so many reports of ivory-billed woodpecker since the World War II era goes pretty much like this. Birders, filled with hopeful optimism and suggestible in the extreme, are primed with an observer expectancy effect. They go out into nature expecting to find ivory-billed woodpecker. Maybe because there's big trees, swamp forest, somebody said there was one there, it was reported there in the 1920s, whatever. And the idea behind this is that it doesn't even need to be a pileated woodpecker. It can be a crow with sunlight on the wings. It can be anything that is remotely the size and shape of an ivory bill, and we will go, there it is. And that's a kind of confirmation bias. It is a real problem with both birders and professional ornithologists who do field work. Both of those groups of people over-report rare birds. They have a tendency to see rare birds when they're not really there, to over-report them. They have a kind of inflated confidence in their ability to find rare birds. Both groups, scientists and birders, especially competitive sport birders. So the idea is, all the evidence out there, our minds fix on just a little slim corner that fits our belief. Our belief is the ivory-billed woodpecker is still there. We see something that fits, and we pull in whatever kind of evidence we can to fit our model. That is the main assumption given for why we have so many incident reports of ivory-bill since the 1940s, when everybody knows it went extinct. There's a problem, several problems with this. Huge and insurmountable problems with this hypothesis. We'll start with this one. A lot of the reports came from people who weren't birders. They didn't know. They didn't have any sense of how special the ivory-billed woodpecker was. They might have been a wildlife biologist taking surveys, a turkey hunter, a squirrel hunter, a kayaker, a canoeist, a number of reasons they might have been out to go, but they weren't all birders. Well, that takes a little bit off our certainty. Many of those individuals weren't even looking for the bird. They stumbled on it. So they didn't go out there primed with hope, looking for a bird that they didn't even know the meaning or the significance of. They, in fact, stumbled on it. Again, cuts away our certainty in our hypothesis. There's another problem with this hypothesis, and that is that searchers can spend years or even decades looking for ivory-bill. I can reel off at least a half a dozen people in the modern era that are doing this or have done it. But here's the thing. Why wait that long to show yourself or other people that you have some sort of inner lack of prudence? Why spend decades looking for something just to magically see something that fits the ivory bill so you can tick it on a list or brag to your friends or whatever? Again, it doesn't line up. It doesn't fit this hypothesis of observer expectancy effect and confirmation bias. You don't need to spend 2 decades doing it. You can go out in a weekend and see a fake ivory bill. There's another chink in the armor. But this is probably the fatal one, because if we dismiss all of these 100 incident reports made for ivory-bill since the 1940s, we are forcing ourselves to commit a huge cognitive mistake called ultimate attribution error. And that is a big mistake as well. We cannot peer into the motives of other people, particularly hundreds of people or tens of people, and guess what their motive was for seeing or reporting an ivory bill. And lastly, given the fact that we've been anchored on this bird's extinction for a century, we're more vulnerable to negativity bias. We're not, as a species, filled with hopeful optimism about ivory bill. In contrast, we're primed to think of it as dead or near dead, and we've been that way for more than 100 years. So again, it takes off this motivation from the table. So again, the main risk is to underreport the bird, not overreport it. And what contributes to that, this something called outcome reporting bias, another trick from our head. Well, why do we underreport ivory-billed woodpecker? Because people don't want to bring harm to the bird. I know for a fact that right today, this is keeping some people from coming forward and providing concrete evidence of the bird. Another reason that the bird is underreported is, hey, if most birders, you go pick up your field guide and says the bird's extinct and go, oh, I must have been mistaken. I couldn't have seen an ivory-billed. It must have been a pileated. And you'll just go on your merry way. A third thing that causes the bird to be underreported is many people, especially in the South, don't trust outside organizations, and they're not likely to divulge any kind of information that might bring in outside authority, government or nonprofits, conservation nonprofits, and so on. Some observers that are more aware about the bird's history, they're reluctant to speak because they know people are going to come after them in hostile ways to denigrate their find and to attack their credibility. History is replete with examples of people who this has happened to. And again, if you are one of these aware people and you know the history of ivory-billed, very little incentive to come forward if you know that's what's ahead of you. A fifth reason for outcome reporting bias is that many people who see it, particularly non-birders, non-scientists, people who are not that aware of the bird's history, are cut off from these social identities. They wouldn't know who to report the bird to anyway. If you're someone that lives in the rural South and you saw an ivory-bill every other week, you wouldn't know who to report that to. You're cut off in social space from the places where it might be of most interest. But here's the biggest reason why we underreport ivory-bill. The priming that we have is not for the bird's happy survival, it's that it's dead. And that creates so much cognitive discord in us. When we see, and I have read accounts of people who have claimed to see ivory-bill, what they describe happens internally then can be likened to shock, because you have to reorient your thought processes, your beliefs. They're shattered. They're utterly shattered. If you're anchored on extinction and you see a living ivory-bill, the shock to the system can be so great that you either have to talk yourself out of the sighting, turn basically that conflict on yourself, or you come to the stances, I've got to come forward with this, I've got to believe it because I saw what I saw, and that's going to put me in opposition to my peers. That's a hard thing for most people to do. So when you stack all these 6 things up with each other, we're very much more likely to underreport than overreport the bird. And that doesn't mean that any one incident is accurate. There's probably some fraction that are inaccurate, of course there are. But the fact that we're exaggerating the number of woodpeckers seen since the 1940s is hard to persist in. That belief is hard to maintain given these other items here. I'm going to close with this, and that is that the night parrot of Australia has done the same thing to conservation biologists, to birders, and to scientists as the ivory-bill has done to us. It has messed with birders down under since the early 1900s. It has the same aggravating tendency to put people at antagonistic odds with each other, to promote conspiracy beliefs, to create all kinds of allegorical and mythical comparisons. And the bird is similar in some ways because it's nomadic, hard to find, elusive, and it went missing for 9 years more than the ivory-bill did. So it's not unusual for other rare or near extinct birds to also play havoc with our heads. And if you're more interested in how this happens, you can pick up a copy of my book, Woody's Last Laugh. It should be available sometime on Amazon and at the publisher's website early next month.
So Chris, thanks so much for giving the presentation. It was definitely very interesting. And I have never actually publicly expressed an opinion on the ivory-billed one way or another. And all I have to go off of is people's reaction to the things we've posted or things that people have sent us. And one thing I noticed is a couple people have said, I think I might have a picture or a video of the ivory-billed, and thus far it's inevitably been affiliated. I'm still hoping that sometimes somebody does send something in and it's actually, like, whoa, that could potentially be it. But one of my questions I wanted to ask was, we both noticed, Derek and I, that there's this strange fervor or vitriol that you mentioned from both sides on this issue. And the only other place I've seen it is politics with these, hot button type issues. And when it boils down to it, it's a potentially extinct or potentially still alive bird. Why does that cause people to be so angry about their stance on it?
It's a good question. I think it's fundamentally about uncertainty. And so as individuals, we vary in how much uncertainty we can handle. So you might be able to handle a lot more uncertainty than I can. I might be able to take a little more than the next person. But it is on sex, politics, and religion that people tend to be their most emotional or their most adamant. And it's because those are such big issues. I mean, the huge questions of who are we, where do we come from, where are we going, why are we here? There's not one answer for that. There's thousands of answers. And so those thousands of answers are called denominations, religions, and spiritual paths. And they can pit people against each other because one person is sure they're right, the other one is sure they're right. In the case of the ivory-billed woodpecker, and it's whether it's extinct or extant, that's a binary choice. It can't be both. It's either one or the other. Now, we know that the ivory bill is a real entity. We have plenty of evidence that it's not a unicorn, it's not Loch Ness Monster, it's not Sasquatch. We know it's real. And so the default for something that we know is demonstrably real should be, well, it's still real. It's still real until we have evidence that it's dead. The only thing I can think is that some people, the people that create the smoke, the friction about ivorybill, I'm probably committing at least one cognitive bias here, but I'm going to say that they're probably less likely to hold uncertainty than a person that goes, who cares? And so they're rushing into certitude because holding ambiguity and a never-ending, open-ended nature to this thing is just painful. And for some human beings, uncertainty is physically painful to hold. There's another thing that is going on with our heads with ivorybill. It's called lack of object constancy. When a child sees their mother leave the room, they start crying because in their heads, mom is gone forever. She's disappeared. As we get older, we don't have that same sense. We know that mom's just in the kitchen making dinner. We don't think she's gone forever. Unfortunately, there are some birders and some scientists who are more on the infantile end of psychological development when it comes to object inconstancy. And they have, I've called this the birders' belief that ivorybill should be Netflix, a movie on demand. We should be able to go out and pop it up and get it into our perceptual awareness pretty much on demand. And nature's just not always like that.
So it's very frustrating for them then to not be able to have that answer. So then the default is, well, I'm going to swing the other way on it.
Correct. Because uncertainty is actually painful. It's so it creates anxiety and it creates a sense of tension that a rush into certitude either direction is better than hanging out in that neverland. And I really think that that's what's going on. In fact, I would go further and say I don't think that the disputes that we see about ivorybill are necessarily interpersonal at all. I think they come from people's varying ability to hold a lot of information or to just reside with a lot of ambiguity. My official stance is I don't know if the bird's alive or dead because the kind of information I need as a scientist just isn't there.
Mm-hmm. I think we can put on record that we all feel the same, like we just don't know.
Hmm.
Um,
I hope it's still out there. That'd be awesome.
um, I had two things. One is when you're talking about the more people are, thinking they see ivory bills as pileated. Why is that more common than the curlews or the warbler? The only thing I can think of is the pileated can be more of a backyard bird. So I think people are just more exposed to it. I think if, hooded warblers showed up as feeder birds more often, you'd probably have more reports for Bachman's warblers. That's the only thing I can think of for that. But also, how much of an effect do you think the Cornell rediscovery had on people being unwilling to report their sightings? Because after that whole thing, like there was so much excitement, and I heard of people from that experience having like PTSD over the whole thing, of people
Yeah.
saying it was just a pileated. Like it just seemed like it was such a debacle that, like, do you think that then affected people after that?
Not only do I think it affected them, I mean, I know it did. And many of those people did not want to come forward. They didn't ask for this. And Mindy LaBranch was part of the team at Cornell. She had a PhD in woodpecker ecology. She was an avowed skeptic. She said she was also not a lucky birder. She was sure that the bird was extinct, and she saw it. And Tim Gallagher describes a gathering where they're sort of talking about this sometime during the search. And she's standing over there, and she occasionally joins the conversation, but then he calls, retreats into herself because she's in shock. And he says, Mindy, why do you said 99% certain it was an ivory-billed. Where is that 1% coming from? And she goes, because it was freaking extinct. She's still wrestling with it, and she's wrestling with it so dramatically that she's an observant person would see this as someone who's in shock. Their cognitive processes have been so challenged by what they've seen that they're having to reorient themselves, and that's extremely distressing. So you have those people, then you have people that maybe my age or older who remember what happened to George Lowry, John Dennis, and anyone and everyone who's come forward. And that's, I hadn't given those much thought, but when the Cornell thing happened and I saw the reaction to it, I just went, there's something else going on here. It can't be just about this bird. No bird in the planet is worth all that.
Well, it's funny because I've had the thought before, just because of how crazy it is. Like, is there a conspiracy? I'm like, is the government involved? Is it a moon landing situation? It's just like, it's so strange because you wouldn't think that this sort of thing would do that.
Well, but you can, though. You can imagine if you have something that's uncertain and it just gives you just enough little glimmers of possibility that it would feed everything. Magical thinking, conspiracy beliefs, the government's keeping the whereabouts of the bird secret.
Birds actually aren't real, and it's been a drone this whole time.
I mean, you could go on and on and on, because with that much uncertainty, you can park so much stuff in it. And unfortunately, a lot of that stuff is junk. But our minds need stories. We don't lock on numbers or ambiguity well, so we need a story. And I find myself, as much time as I spend on this, I still will have a day where, Chris, if someone put a gun to your head and said, is it alive or dead, where would you go?
I would just scream, I don't know. And I was thinking about that exact situation. I was like, what do I even believe? Because I'm sort of you have to see it to believe it kind of person. And so, somebody saying, hey, I have pictures of it, but I'm never going to give them to someone because I don't want the whereabouts of the bird to be found out. I'm kind of like, oh, well, yeah, it doesn't exist. And I'm like, but what if it does? What if they're telling the truth? And it's just back and forth. I would just scream, I don't know. And then that would be it.
Okay, Chris, this is something that's bothered me for a while, is that The Lenovo video is very contested, but that trip
Mhm.
they also recorded double knocks and what sounded like Kent calls. And there's
Yeah.
been other recordings of supposed Kent calls too. And to me, that's the strongest evidence because unless someone else can come up with something else that's making that, I know people say Blue Jays make similar calls, but I've listened and they sound quite different. Why don't people address the call evidence? And if it's not Ivory Bills, can somebody tell me what it is?
Yeah, well, there's several answers to that. First of all, when you have multiple observers all seeing the same kind of ivory bill, which is what happened in the Arkansas incident, and you did have some video captures of a big bird that had some characteristics that were problematic for pileated and frankly fit Campephalus woodpeckers. If you the body of evidence is what's strong. It's the sightings plus the sound recordings plus crappy images, but collectively they're all suggestive. Let's call them suggestive or consistent with Ivorybill. And that would, I think, if Cornell had used those words, suggestive or consistent, there might have been a little bit less of a blowback. But they used words like definitive, conclusive, and proof. That's the language of birding, competitive birding. It's like they dangled a red banner in front of a really hostile bull and said, we have definitive, conclusive proof of Ivorybill. Birding, birding then goes, nope, that's our turf. We are the ones who decide what's definitive and conclusive. And so that was one of the things that contributed to the blowback and the controversy and the backs and forths and the debates and so forth. But what birding did, what a sector of birding did very effectively was they cleaved off the most ambiguous part of that evidence, not the totality, but they took one or two frames from the Lenovo video and they attacked it on its weakest flanks, and it worked. It worked almost to perfection. But that's called fallacy of division. It's a conjunction fallacy. It's another cognitive error because the strength of the evidence was in its totality, not in little pieces.
Chris, you're going to be my fallacy guy. If I ever need to know about a certain fallacy, I'm going to you. Additionally, I was reading through the reports of sightings in the past, 10, 20, 30 years. There seems to be a theme of someone will see a bird, it'll be a fairly convincing sighting. They'll have like details of features that make sense. A team goes out to look and they find nothing. Is it possible that it's like more of a nomadic species that's moving from one area where like that type
It's
of
almost,
searching doesn't work,
yeah,
or do we
it's
just not know?
two things can contribute to that. They both have to do with the life history of the bird. Yes, it's almost certainly nomadic. Tanner described it as like looking for a needle in a moving haystack or a moving needle in a haystack. And if you read his field notes, he complained quite bitterly about how difficult the birds were to follow. In fact, all of them were hard to follow, except for the one that he had under surveillance at the nest cavity. You can go elsewhere. Whitney Eastman looked for the birds in North Florida in the 1950s. He said they were like a wandering duo of gypsies. They would see the bird or hear it, it would fly off, and then it would be gone, or they might hear it, but it was frustrating in the extreme to sort of stay with the bird. The wing profiles and the flight speed are suggestive of a bird that made its living by moving over big distances. So there's that. The other aspect of it is when groups go in, you can't have even two people, never mind three or four, walking around without making lots of noise and talking. And Tanner and Kellogg said that they were standing under a tree catching bark scalings from an ivory bill that they knew was above them, and they could never see it. So the bird can be right next to one and be essentially invisible. And when you put all that together, I don't find it very startling that we haven't gotten good images of it, again, because we've only been able to do that one time ever. And if we could duplicate those conditions, we might be able to increase our odds for getting a good image. But the other thing I wanted to say is that searchers today, some of them are using a different technique, which is to go in before dawn, sit quietly in full turkey hunting camo, and sit quietly and listen and look for the birds, and then move every day to some new place and kind of do the same thing. And there are, I don't know, but there are people who have said that some of the past search teams were far too noisy and conspicuous to match what might be an extremely elusive bird. And there is this myth that the bird was incautious and half tame. But if you read what hunters said in the 1800s, they were aggravated in the extreme at how hard this bird was to shoot. And they were trying. I mean, they were doing everything they could to kill it because it was so valuable in these sorts of trades of skins that were going on in the 1800s. But one of them said he saw 8 birds and couldn't get a shot off at any of them.
Yeah, I do think people underestimate how difficult it is to kind of make a search. Because here where I am in South Louisiana, there's not a lot of access to land. Also, you have to think about the kind of habitat you're in. Like, you may need a kayak. That kayak's probably got to have camo on it. You've got to have camo clothing. There's also hunting season to worry about. You definitely don't want to be out walking up on a hunter while you're trying to find an ivory-billed and get shot or something like that. And then there's just like so many areas that, you know, people aren't consistently going. And there's just a lot of factors that, you know, I feel like people in other areas don't really think about unless you're actually down here and you see it and you live in it.
Well, I have spent some time in bottomland hardwood forest, not for ivory-billed, not for birds even. I was doing work on fish and other aquatic life. And it's a nasty habitat to get around quietly and unobtrusively. It's just not, it's not arranged in a way that you can move about in stealthy ways, generally speaking. And then if you do see something, it's not like in the prairies where you can just sort of, you know, I mean, I hunt sharp-tailed grouse in northern Nebraska. Well, if one gets up and lands 200 yards away, you just walk. You know, you see it, you see where it lands, and you keep walking. You can't do that in southern bottomland hardwood forest, particularly during flooding. And it's just extremely problematic terrain to look for a big, even a big, but mobile and wary bird. Again, that doesn't mean that it's there, but it doesn't shock me that it would be so difficult to find. In fact, I was talking with someone that, you know, you could almost reverse engineer all of the sighting reports. It would go like this. You could hypothesize that there were no 5, 20, 100, 1,000 birds, everything in between. How many would you expect to get given the number that we get over the decades? And you could reverse engineer that to come up with maybe a maximum number. It would be plausible to account for all of the sighting reports. Mike Collins has done that. I think he came up with around 100 birds. And there are probably far more sophisticated ways of doing that. But it's hard for me to, while I think the bird could be extinct, it's not over the years acted like a species that's extinct. Generally speaking, the sightings drop off. You get 1 or 2, and then nothing. That's what happened eventually with passenger pigeon and Carolina parakeet. Not right away, There were a couple of site reports, I think into the 20s or even 30s for one of them, maybe the Carolina parakeet. But eventually they stopped altogether and there was never any doubt. And that's what I would expect for an extinct bird.
Yeah, Ryan, did you have a question?
Yeah, one other question that I had was actually kind of in relation to what you said about the Damar flycatcher, and you kind of saw it a little bit with with the Ivory-billed woodpecker. But why does it seem like science is sometimes so lackadaisical about species that could be extinct or near extinct?
Well, because there are so many species that need protection and attention, and we don't have the resources to cover them all. But if you're asking why we're reckless with labeling things extinct, okay. A lot of that comes from advocacy. Early on, conservation thought that in order to scare ourselves into the right action, let's assume that animals are extinct. We'll assume they're gone. And if by chance we discover them that they're still there, that's great. But we're going to put them in the ledger of extinction. Why? Because that'll better impress upon the public the need for protections, for effort, for natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. So we erred early in conservation in leaning towards declaring things extinct through default. Eventually, conservation learned, wait a minute, that's not a good way to build trust either. Because if we're exaggerating extinction, what will happen is the public won't believe us. If we come back and say, hey, we discovered something is very much alive, they're going to go, what are you guys trying to pull on us? And so they then changed the standards of evidence more like what IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and BirdLife International uses, which is you have to go out and survey enough to show that something is not there.
You know, like what you just said actually really made a lot of sense to me as far as like a certain narrative, because if they release that list of birds presumed extinct and the Ivorybill is not on there, it's not as much of a headline as 22 bird or however many it was, including the Lord God bird, are extinct. We need to conserve. Like it's a very much stronger conservation push saying, look what we did to this majestic bird that no longer exists. If you don't have that, it's a much less flashy headline. I don't know if that played any role into it, but it's interesting to think about.
It is a question that I asked because I noticed in some newspaper articles, I saw one, unfortunately, in my hometown paper that pivoted right away to climate change. See here, people, climate change is bad and we have to do something. I'm sorry, almost none of those species that were proposed as going extinct or near extinct have anything to do with climate change. But the messaging and the advocacy, and this is a problem, frankly, with many in the environmental movement and many entities and organizations. They like to message around charismatic things, but that's hijacking really the Ivorybill story. Whatever else the Ivorybill is doing, I don't believe climate change can be brought in as a material factor one way or the other. I mean, there are far more pressing issues. But conservation erred early in the 50s by tallying species as extinct that weren't defaulting that way, but they eventually realized, no, we can't do that. So now there's this real stringent evidence. And my belief is that in conservation biology, we should use evidentiary protocols that human medicine uses. As long as there's a prospect of life, we're gonna bend heaven and earth to increase or facilitate that prospect of life. We're not going to assume that something's dead until the evidence is conclusive.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was fine with it being critically endangered as it was before. I think a lot of people's concerns are that if they declare it extinct, then people could shoot it without repercussion. They could get rid of habitat that, might contain the species. I think those are some of the main concerns with this. But in my opinion, if they do exist, they're declared extinct and we're not going to alter the habitat and people aren't going to recklessly hunt them, I don't know if it really makes that much of a difference.
That's a big question, is whether they would still be protected under, even if they're not on the endangered species list, would Ivorybill still be protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, where it's protected now? And I don't know the answer. I've heard professional opinions both ways, that it would still be protected. And one person who was quite knowledgeable saying, no, it's not. We don't put extinct birds on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That's ridiculous. If it's not on the list, there is no protection. Now that, I think, is a legitimate concern. Habitat, maybe, but there are other reasons to save bottomland hardwoods, and we're already doing that, so I have less concern there. But here's the thing. The bird has frustrated conservation biology. It's never stuck in one place. You know, we want to put a little preserve in a park over there and have things nice and tidy. And, you know, look what we did. We made a refuge for this little plant or animal. And Ivorybill has just frustrated us time and again with that whole paradigm. And that's the problem with the bird, not a problem. It frustrates every one of our social identities that have of investment in the bird. It frustrates birding, frustrates science. You can't do anything with a sample size between 0 and 1. It's impossible. Birding, well, we can't go out and verify it with digital images that are put on eBird and passed by the eBird editor this afternoon. Well, it doesn't exist. Conservation biology, what can we do? Where can we get money to go do what we want to do for? You can't with Ivorybill. And it, because it doesn't fit any of our models, I think that's another reason why it is inherently controversial. Yeah, we can't put it anywhere.
Something that bothered me was with the headlines. They were like, oh, Ivorybill extinct, when it was just the proposal. Like, there was still the comment period and still not an official thing. And then a bunch of people online were like, well, it's official, it's gone, this entity declared it, so it must be that it doesn't, like, they just completely accepted it without even thinking about it. Right. Which is a little frightening.
That's an appeal to authority. Again,
because you got your policy information.
Yeah. It is. But I guess in this age of information warfare, it probably shouldn't surprise us that we fall so easily to misinformation. But again, I laughed when I saw the headlines. I literally laughed, and not because I don't think extinction is serious. It is, but I was like, okay, the woodpecker's doing it to us again. we started in 1913 declaring extinct. Why should we act any different this time? I mean, you know, we're just getting set up to be hoodwinked again, in my opinion.
Well, we'll give you a new idea for your second book then in that series for Woody.
Yes.
Ryan, did you have any more questions?
No, I don't think I had anything else, but I'm really appreciative that you came on and spent the time with us, Chris. This has been a really interesting topic, of course, ever since the declaration or the news of the declaration. So it seems like people are always very interested to hear more about the Ivory-billed.
It is a fascinating bird, and after I finished my book project, I finally came to realize why it so captivates us. Dead or alive, it's beaten us. It's literally, it doesn't matter what it's beaten us at our own game. And you kind of have to admire anything in nature. You know, it didn't sit while we watched it languish in its death throes, like the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet. Didn't do that, wouldn't. And it didn't let us rescue it. And there's something almost admirable in a species that basically thumbs its nose at mankind and said, dead or, you know, whatever my fate, I'm gonna cut my own path.
The avian cowboy at the last frontier of the southern forest.
That is exactly how the last chapter of my book ends. It fits the whole frontier lone cowboy mentality. And I think that's one of the reasons why we find it so captivating. We just cannot let go of this bird.
It kind of has that same wandering spirit
Yeah,
in some way that the United States has in its inception. And that makes
ex-
total sense then as to
it's
why
a
we would feel such a connection to the bird.
it's a quintessential American bird. I mean, it literally is the embodiment of the American myth of the frontier. I don't know if you've ever seen Once Upon a Time in the West, but at the end, the two protagonists, as the railroad joins up and the frontiers close, these two nomads, like the Ivorybill, the two nomads go, we're not for civilization. We're going to get on our horse and we're going to ride out away. And that's how the movie ends. And somewhere, sometime, the Ivorybill very well may disappear for us. But until that evidence is overwhelming, we're still going to be looking for Butch Cassidy. Just, it's still going to be, it could be or it couldn't be. It's just a myth that we can't let go of.
Yeah, well, I think that's great. A great ending to our talk, and we'll put a link in the description to the book so people can check it out. Can we also add your contact info in there, Chris, for them if
Yeah,
they want to contact
absolutely.
you?
Absolutely. Okay. You have it in my
Yep, I got it.
signature.
So I'll put it in the description for everybody.
Yep.
Be expecting a copy to be sent our way too, Chris. A signed copy. Definitely has to be signed.
You send me an address and it'll be in the mail.
Perfect.
All right, good deal. Thanks so much, Chris, for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Derek and Ryan. Have a good evening.
You too.